This video is dedicated to my brother. It was one of his stories that inspired this entire story, and by extension the core of our entire universe, honestly. His characters and stories were the beginning, so thank you, Dark Entity, for everything you've helped us build. Warning: the following video contains hot takes, opinions that may change with time, and cringe, as well as references to violence, murder, neglect, child exploitation, pedophilia, mental health neglect, psychotic episodes, absent parents, and Jeffrey Bezos. Viewer discretion is advised. Hey everyone, I'm Veep for Verbatim, and I've sufficiently tasted the rainbow today. I'm back for a final video in a 3-part series of character redraws and revisions. The Refraction Force story, or story 1 of like 15 or 16. We'll see how many we do. For this video, we're finally going to get into the characters that started it all, and I'm so freaking excited. You have no idea how hard it is to watch characters grow and change over time, but you're not able to talk about them because they don't exist to anybody but yourself. It's really frustrating. For this video, I will be discussing the current revised version of the Astral story. To keep this video as comprehensible as possible, I'll be talking about anything you might need to know first before we get to the actual character's story, with only the highest of quality drawings from my childhood to illustrate things. And I'll be drawing the most recent iteration of these characters right before your very eyes today. Here's just some basic lore stuff in case you're interested. Of course, I've touched on a couple of these ideas before in my past 2 videos, but obviously you might not have watched them, or you might just not be interested in watching those redraws, because honestly, that's a solid 50 minutes of your time, and I can understand. So, I'll try to summarize anything here that may be important to these characters specifically. First, the Astrals are the children of the sun, hence the name Astral. The sun is an ancient Peligera named Flashion-Thero Gajar. Yes, the name's terrible, and I'll be calling him Flash. He's a Peligeran prince, destined to take his place as the homeworld for a species by his father's side, since the descendants of the ancient Peligera are super tiny and live on their royal ancestors. There are currently 3 living homeworlds with royal blood, 1 dead one that's harvested for parts, as dark as that sounds, and a few bastard suns off in space for a bit of colorful variety. One day, Flash is going to be the leader of this massive imperialistic empire that spans millions of planets, colonies, and weapons depots. He'd have fleets of ruthless soldiers, thousands of brilliant scientists, etc., but that's not really what he wants, since Flash is very much a pacifist. Wasn't this video about the Refraction Force? Moving on. So Flash is just the sun, chilling in space and warming up the planet with his unwavering optimism as one does. I'll explain that whole idea and what exactly the Peligera are in a later video, specifically for the 3rd or 4th story we talk about. But he falls in love with a celestial humbly known as Miss Multiverse. All you need to know is that she's pretty space lady, because she's just a plot device. She carries 7 of the 8 main elements of the universe in gems she calls the multiverse crystals. Infinity Stones, anyone? Flash and Pretty Space Lady get together, and she divides her form into 7 children, 1 for each crystal. Flash watches them grow from afar when he leaves them on Earth under the care of a Peligeran friend, who takes the form of a butler named Sebastian Farnsworth. We already know who he is if you've seen the first redraw video. So that makes 8 kids, 6 Refraction Force members, 1 Peligeran father, 7 crystals, 1 butler, 1 celestial goddess mother, all one big astral family. Does that make sense? Because we're really only on the shallow end, people. As for the whole multiverse crystal thing, it's a rapidly changing concept in a lot of my stories. They were originally basically just Infinity Stones with different corresponding elements depending on what I thought was interesting or made sense to me, but that idea was mostly a foundation. To summarize what I've already said about the multiverse crystals in past videos, they're the source of most superpowers. Fragments of them exist everywhere in the universe in different forms, and their powers woven into the universe itself in overlapping dimensions. The Time, Mind, and Death Realm have been established already, and I've talked about the Death Realm in the previous video, but I imagine other dimensions would include the Dream Dimension, the Glass Dimension, the Soundscape, and those are just a couple of ideas off the top of my head. It could go even crazier than that. While combining all of the crystals for use wouldn't be as difficult as it was for Thanos to collect 6 stones since they're so common, it would still be a challenge for other reasons. Because there are 21 elements for 8 colors. This is where you might start to get overwhelmed, so I'll try to explain how that matters story-wise. The Refraction kids started off with base powers, as young children, which are the powers each multiverse crystal color exhibits as a default. Memory is an exception because she started out with the most matured version of her element, Future, as well as her default, necromancy, both elements under the color purple. When the children cracked their elements in the Shattered Arc, the crystals entered a glowing form, as an energy in their cores was physically expelled. That's what causes the glowing effect. In Order of the Rainbow, they become these elements: fire, mind, time, animal life, water, and necromancy. The third tier that they never reach in their lifetime is when they become inverted. When this happens, a crystal loses all its color, but the colored glow from the core of the gem is still the original element. I never really decided how that would happen until writing this story, so here's how it happened in my revision. When a gem is shattered completely, an inverted element appears in its place. It's kind of like a ghost element. So again, in Rainbow Order, these more abstract elements are energy, manipulation, reflection, decay, matter, and future. You know something's convoluted when you need a big old chart for it. Another note, you may have noticed the black sheep of the family in some of these drawings. It's very subtle. Mamori. It's Mamori. I really don't know why I made her Asian, but it annoys me to no end because it's pointless and honestly kind of weird. I didn't even like anime at the time, so I don't know why I would have done that. But rest assured, dear viewers, I will make this important to the story if it kills me, if it means that I have to change up all the characters, which, in the end, it did. Last thing, there are 8 kids, but I only mentioned 6 by name. That's where the last 3 of the 20 elements come in: Cosmic, Void, and Silence. The Cosmic element is kind of like the Space Infinity Stone, but it has more to do with the creation and destruction of space. The sibling that wields it has a pink color scheme. They're called Celestial or Madison Astral. More terrible names, I am so sorry. Originally, they were a girl that looks the most like their mother, but after drawing them as a dude, I figured they could just alternate between forms whenever they wanted to. There's also their younger sister Demi, and Demi was a byproduct of the creation of the other 7. An action, opposite reaction type thing. She's the power of the void in its physical form, and she has no crystal. As a byproduct of 7 powerful beings' creation, Demi is equal to their combined power, so she's very unstable. Muna transported her into the void so that she could learn to use her powers without ripping the universe apart, all for her own safety. Demi's basically a non-entity in the story, but she does make the void into a kind of nightmarish hellscape for people who get trapped inside of it for a very long time. Okay, last thing. Chicago was renamed Max Chicago in the late 2030s. I don't think I mentioned that before, but that is a sort of cringy detail that may come up again. If I ever call it Chicago or Max Chicago, just know that I basically mean Chicago from like the 2030s, 2040s era. And now let's get to the redesigns of our colorful cast and their fixed stories. Everything from here on out will be adjustments I've already made to their stories, and it's all going to be a story. There's not going to be any talk of the redraws themselves, so I hope you don't mind not getting all of that detail. This is mostly going to be story time, and I hope you guys don't mind that. So let's get to the stories. Jackson Astral. Jackson was the most free-spirited sibling. He had tons of energy in his youth that matured into witty, teasing banter in his later years. As the lovable muscle for the team with his wind and tornado powers, he was Lucas's backup in their many battles together and was the team's cheerleader, if a little bit hard to manage sometimes. He was an eager, compassionate, and dependable team player, even early on. During his time alone, he looked after the Astral child at home as its sole resident. He was falling behind because of his lack of discipline, but all of that changed at this point in his life. His later dedication to his family came from a cleaning lady he hired purely out of the need for company. She didn't stand for his BS and drama, and it was her tough-as-nails attitude that really set him on the right path as a brother. He emotionally surpassed his siblings during this period as he learned to cope with his feelings of abandonment and come to terms with how messed up his childhood was. Jackson and Lucas volunteered to move everything from the Astral household to Max Chicago on foot. Jackson did it as a test of his maturity. Again, emotional intelligence doesn't mean he's not still a dummy. He had a lot of heartfelt conversations with his brother along the way, theoretically, about the growing disparity between Jackson's powers and Lucas's much more developed ones. Before casually fighting Lucas for the team leader spot, Lucas had been discussing Jackson as a leader with his sister Caroline as a joke, until he realized she actually liked the idea. Jackson's crystal was cracked during the fight, and he had a brief lapse of judgment as his tornadoes and new fire abilities combined. He brought Lucas close to death in an event he later called the Dorothy Incident. He returned to his senses and cared for his injured brother until he recovered. Jackson's psychological growth during this time of isolation helped him learn to confront his issues as an emotionally healthy person. so the growing pains he experienced from his cracked crystal didn't impact him as badly as they did for his siblings. He tried to be the human equivalent of a safe space in his mentally fractured family to the best of his ability. He worked with a hero agency they joined to create basic guidelines that would benefit heroes, and he was a firm supporter of maintaining strong law enforcement presence, even with the rise of heroes. He was the last to die when his family was murdered. Jackson's the most inconsistent with his powers because he's clumsy and absent-minded most of the time, just kind of casual about everything. But he went out guns blazing, pun very much intended. He prefers to hang out with his sisters, but Momori is the one he spends the most time with. He's been my favorite brother ever since I first drew him, but things have changed quite a bit with Lucas's revisions. Caroline Astral. Caroline was a goofball that didn't have a filter. She could feel people's emotions, and she would get into the habit of bluntly calling people out when they were being dishonest about their feelings. Despite her unpredictability, she was a very effective mediator in combat because she could reduce intensity of emotions and even change opinions when needed. She was the first to make a human form for herself, and she went undercover as a couples therapist for a villain organization called Phoenix, one of their main enemies. Her plan was to get intel on the organization to share with her brother Lucas, by being a counselor for the husband and wife that led the organization. Unfortunately, she grew to care about the sadistic couple, especially husband Ignatius Godo, who was oddly affectionate around her. Caroline got too close with her targets when Ignatius told her about his fantasies of running away with Caroline and leaving his wife behind. Obviously, with this kind of disturbing development, Caroline had to shut that down and considered the mission a failure. Caroline's ability to control and read minds was unlocked during her Shattered event, which took place when Ignatius' wife, Madame Haim, captured her for her treachery. When her powers activated, she was overwhelmed and completely shut down all brain activity of anyone within a 3-mile radius of her holding cell to stop the noise, effectively killing hundreds. She repressed the memory, but her powers and handling of them made repeat incidents a major concern. Caroline's mind powers didn't have an off switch, so she could see anything and everything people thought about constantly. She'd mask her dysfunctionality with childlike hyperactivity and strangely specific thoughts her siblings would have. She reached her breaking point during the Imperius incident, when she took over the minds of everyone in Chicago, the result of a mental breakdown. Her siblings finally found a way to turn off her powers to stop her, but the damage was already done to her psyche and she never really found true peace. She was the first to be murdered, so her suffering at least ended quickly. The mind element is one of the most dangerous elements. In fact, the main antagonist of this story and others tend to have access to the mind element. Not only can it be devastating for a villain to be able to stop a person's brain or know all their secrets, but the mental strain is often too much, even for heroic wielders. However, Caroline's inability to master her element may have been a sign that she was just no longer compatible with her own element. Lucas Astral. Lucas was an optimistic, unrelenting leader as a child, the one that resembled his astral father the most in appearance and funny disposition. He used his abilities mostly to create powerful rainbow lasers, see in the dark, and to create illusions even later on. He was arrogant though, which wasn't helped by his siblings always praising him. He had a love-hate relationship with Sebastian Farnsworth, his caretaker, because the butler called him out for his narcissistic tendencies in a kind way and brought him back down to earth. Lucas did appreciate it in hindsight, but found it irritating early on. Lucas fought Phoenix with Caroline occasionally assisting him. He became known as the #1 hero in California, which certainly didn't help with the ego. He joked about Jackson taking over the team, and Caroline was on board because she started to worry that Lucas's obsession with hero work would take a toll on him. Lucas only really took the part about him being weak to heart, so he decided that he would present Jackson with the idea the next time they spoke, with the intention of engaging in combat alone. Alone where he had the best chance of not being distracted. The fight between the two escalated. Lucas was completely destroyed in combat by a newly awakened Jackson, and Lucas gave Jackson full control of their team when he recovered. Just beneath the surface though, his superiority complex crumbled into desperation to prove himself. Lucas's own Shattered event happened when he and Jackson reformed the Refraction Force in Maxicago. He cracked his crystal when he confronted the Bezos-type main villain character shortly after arriving in the city. We'll get to him in a bit, but for now, Lucas. His new power consuming him was what initiated the Joshua incident, where Lucas tore a hole in reality to the time dimension and tried to stop the flow of time completely to prove a delusional point. Jackson had to put Lucas out of commission to save him from himself. Unfortunately, Lucas's days without anxiety and paranoia were long gone. During his last few years as a hero, Lucas struggled to move past his old position on the team. He struggled with his self-worth, he grew suspicious of Matthew and Jackson's destructive abilities, and he became very hesitant about trusting anyone. A downward spiral into paranoia that was worsened by Momori telling him the truth, that their team would fall as a result of their crumbling family. He poured himself into hero work, ignoring the cracks that Momori predicted in favor of praising his siblings for surface-level achievement in what he thought would save the team. Lucas was killed right before Jackson, when he finally realized he wasn't worth more or less than his siblings. He gave Jackson an opening to escape, while he attempted to reason with their murderer. It was in his last moment that he realized he needed to set aside his issues, to help the person that he truly failed to save. Lucas got along well with Caroline and Matthew because they listened to him, but originally didn't like Jackson for his lack of discipline, and later for his ability to succeed without putting in as much effort as Lucas. Also, Lucas's actual name is Austin, but he prefers Lucas. Madison Astral. Madison didn't start out as approachable or outgoing as her other siblings. She was very soft-spoken and bashful, but could become intimidating when she used her necromancy or told gruesome stories about people's futures using her abilities. She was the quiet kid in the back of the classroom that would go off on anybody once and nobody messed with them ever again, with her siblings and her enemies. She developed a strict code when using future vision very early on. She would look into the future, but only look so far, and the information she would look for was just as stringent. Madison studied abroad in Japan, accompanied by Sebastian Farnsworth, who kept her safe and informed about findings related to the mystic arts. Keep in mind she still hasn't taken on a new form at this point. She protected her school from deadly future events popping up everywhere around the school. Madison became friends with a girl who was being bullied for being half Filipino. Though Madison was friends with her, she also had feelings for the girl. Her crystal cracked when she stood up to her friend's bullies after confessing her feelings to her. She unlocked the ability to kill anyone with a single touch, the power she only used on one child that threatened to kill her friend in that instant. She was able to see ghosts with her new powers and realized she was surrounded by an energy that attracted ghosts to her and to the school itself. To protect her lover and the other students, she left the school and continued her studies alone with Sebastian, taking on a new form with the name Momori in honor of the lover she left behind. Momori saw the deaths of her siblings and the culprit while training with Sebastian in Chicago. He pushed her to pursue further looks into the future, and ashamed of how he failed her as a mentor, Sebastian Farnsworth left Earth, with Momori taking his place as a familial mentor. Jackson and Lucas gradually pried the truth out of Momori, lessening her burden. The cracking of her crystal also caused her visions to become less clear, and she was left feeling doubtful about the future, and disconnected from the present. She was the second to die, and given the short window of time she had to react, she took a piece of each of her siblings' souls, sending them into the world to lay dormant until they were needed again. Though Jackson and Lucas's heroic efforts allowed the team to live on in the memories they saved, Momori's quick thinking and last effort to redeem herself saved the team in a more literal sense. Her own soul fragment split in two, with the second piece later becoming her son's body after fusing with her past lover's grandchild in the future. In a way, she still had kids, but I made it a little less creepy and weird. Charlotte's Charlie Astral. Charlie was a pacifist. She was the most obedient when Lucas told her what to do in combat, but she wouldn't do anything against her principles. She was very spacey and occasionally cowardly until her encounter with Cataclysm, but even afterwards she was very much a flower girl, very flowy, easy to get along with, and never in a hurry to do things unless it involved her family, whom she was very close to and affectionate towards. She especially adored Matthew because of his gentle spirit and his love for her friendly plants. Willow's solo years were spent in Big Bear, California, where she bought 2 patches of forest land for 2 different summer camps. One for entertaining children with their powers and going on nature walks, and the other for rehabilitating villains. Right next to each other, she, like Jackson, is not the brightest. She learned a lot from the Lakota group she partnered with. Their philosophies, their practices, their view of using the land and all its resources, even if it involved killing and eating animals. Willow learned to let go of her pacifist ideals and veganism because of their lessons. When the villains of one camp captured the children of the other and burned down half the forest, Willow broke. Her crystal cracked from the mental strain. She created an army of creatures, amalgamations of many different species, to push the villains back and save the children. Charlie in her later years as a hero would go back and forth between being a peace-loving pixie dream girl with her family to going berserk on villains with their powers, desperate to prevent what happened to the camp children from happening again. Jackson had to keep her and her powers in check by using his own powers to destroy her less stable creations. The relationship became strained as a result. Charlie was despondent after learning of Momori's visions, and through the realization, she came to terms with how much she wanted to live a normal life and see the world. She and Matthew stayed close, but their shared desire to run away from their struggles didn't stop Charlotte from becoming more distant. She was the third sibling to die, but her murder granted her last wish to see the world by flying her up to view the planet from space. She died from the lack of oxygen, but was honestly the most content. Matthew Astral. Matthew, more than Momori, was the quiet kid of the team and the wet blanket of a person. Lucas didn't tell him what to do in combat much, because unlike Jackson, Charlie, and even Momori to an extent, he didn't really see Matthew's ice powers as valuable, especially since he was smaller and weaker than his siblings. Matt didn't mind back then. He kept his head low and spent most of his time studying robotics and the nature of his siblings' powers. He figured his value to the team could be from afar. He was genuinely a team player, just as much as his siblings, but he was just rarely put in the game. Matthew's chance to shine came when he went solo. He spent that time in Chicago as a promoter for an up-and-coming hero agency. He was given access to training facilities, a place to sleep, and time to discuss his plans for the agency with the head of the whole operation himself. He felt important during this period, and as his self-esteem improved, so did his skill in combat. He was sent into battle more and more often as he became the most effective at keeping a group called the Beta Experiments at bay. They were children used as test subjects by a man named Max, the villainous Bezos type who pulled every string and brought all villain connections he had to Chicago. In fact, he was the customer of Mind and Time Master that brought them there to, as I said in the other video, make the Refraction Force's life hell. It was all in an effort to combat Matthew and the hero agency he was a part of. Matthew really established a reputation as a dependable, powerful hero, a reputation that was quickly forgotten when his employer asked him to invite the other Astrals to Chicago. Matthew's name and feats were quickly forgotten when his family reunited in Chicago, leaving him devastated. Matthew's crystal shattered from the mental strain, but he didn't experience the release of energy or the power awakening that his other siblings did, which made him grow increasingly resentful of his situation. His siblings always loved him and treated him kindly, if a little patronizingly, but in Matthew's eyes, he was the runt of the litter that would never surpass his siblings. He was, however, able to find comfort in Cassidy Joyce, an artificially created human made by Max to look like his childhood lover. She was a sociopathic super genius that learned how to be human from the Astrals when they took her in, despite them being anything but human themselves. Matthew and Cassidy became close friends because they both felt like runts of the litter in their own ways. Matthew ended up developing unreciprocated feelings for her. Unfortunately, her heart belonged to the man that tormented her because her perception of love remained broken for a long time. Matthew was not murdered at age 16 because he was the one who took the lives of his siblings. The Astrals fell to a sort of domino effect, a result of each of the Astrals' internal struggles contributing to or distracting from Matthew's resentment and desperation as he fell from grace. The inciting event? Momori's self-fulfilling prophecy. Momori saw that Matthew would kill the entire family after losing his memories, and told him in hopes that knowing would create a new future. He and Momori tried to keep it hidden from the team, but it wasn't a secret for long. Matthew became increasingly cornered, lashing out at his siblings for little things in his denial. Sleep offered him no comfort either, and on an especially bad day, he tried to stab Jackson just to get it over with. Jackson talked him down, but Matthew couldn't stand to see what he was becoming and fled. The taxi he was in was hit by another car just before he got out of the city, so he lost his memories because of Momori's prediction. His crystal was destroyed completely in the event, leaving him powerless as well as without his memories. Caroline's weakness was the next fatal flaw. She was unable to restore Matthew's memories because she couldn't even handle her own powers for long periods of time. Matthew was stuck living with his Astral family with no memories of his heroic life, no power, and a mysterious white crystal reappearing where his old one had been lost. Lucas's obsession was also damning. Lucas only ever focused on how his siblings succeeded as heroes. When Matthew lost everything, he wasn't able to properly support his brother or care about him because he was no longer the one thing Lucas validated. Charlie's escapism impacted Matthew worst of all. Charlie was there for her siblings less and less as her desire to leave heroics behind extended to leaving her siblings behind. She was Matthew's emotional anchor, and without her, Matthew had no one to turn to when confronting his deteriorating sense of self and resentment. Which brings us to Jackson's burden. He exhausted himself trying to keep his family and the city afloat, to the point that he could no longer defend his siblings when it mattered the most. He wasn't even able to be there for Matthew in his emotional turmoil. Thus, the ultimate fate of Matthew Astral, and the family itself, was set in stone. Matthew was mentally exhausted despite losing his memories, and he wanted to understand why. He was confronted by a creature he assumed was a spirit, who would visit him at night when he was alone. The creature would tell Matthew honeyed stories about his future as a leader beyond the Astrals. He was there when the Astrals had seemingly abandoned him, and Matthew learned to harness his inverted elemental crystal with his companion as his guide. He had the power of matter, which allowed him to shift the form and characteristics of substances around him. With Matthew's trust, the spirit could enact his true plan. The creature's real name was MX, a demon banished to the mind realm millennia before his encounter with Matthew. He was a demon of lust and greed and wanted everyone to suffer, so he saw Matthew as an opportunity to do just that. He told Matthew that the Astrals had stolen his memories and wanted to keep him weak for their own self-interest. He chipped away at what insecurities remained from Matthew's past life. His frustration with being small, his intense self-hatred, until Matthew made a deal to share his body with MX, so that he could achieve what MX had predicted. Matthew had effectively sold his soul and body to the malicious creature once MX entered the physical world through his puppet, Matthew. Matthew himself was banished to the mind realm in MX's place, where he would have been. In his struggle to return to his body to undo what he had unleashed onto the world, he fell into an unending nightmare of the in-between, the void. In Matthew's place in the physical world stood a young Max Astral, the very enemy Matthew had fought in his years as a solo hero, the very enemy that had made Matthew so renowned in the first place. To recap, here's a rundown of the three characters that make up Max Astral. MX, a demon that accesses consciousness. Matthew, the previous consciousness that was banished to the void and is currently being used as MX's flesh puppet. Max Astral, the combination of the two. Because MX agreed to share Matthew's body, the tiniest piece of Matthew's mind remains in Max, but was twisted by MX's dominant consciousness and actions. Max constantly switches between two personalities, an intelligent hostile manipulator, MX, and a maddened childlike sociopath, fractured Matthew. So, Max Astral killed his siblings on their 16th birthday as Memori predicted. Caroline and Memori were the first to go, Willow next, but Max showed her mercy, as she was the only one who hadn't looked down on him. Lucas was killed much more brutally, and Jackson fell to his brother last, embracing him in his last moments of consciousness as a gesture of forgiveness. The last of Matthew's sanity also died with his siblings. Max had 5 corpses on his hands, but he saw a future for himself in the past. Using all 6 of the astral crystals, he took them from his siblings' bodies and removed his own. He traveled back to the past with blueprints he stole from his future self's company Legacy. With that, he began his global conquest and evolved into a maddened recluse, fueled only by his demonic greed and lust. So with all that dramatic story out of the way, here's a couple of my final thoughts. The reason I keep coming back to this story, I think, is the foundation. Like, I don't want to brag or anything, but I feel like there's a few decent ideas in here, and I want to keep expanding them and connecting everything. And another thing, I gave these guys a lot more story, but I think they could use either a little less or a little more depending on which character it is. The girls have always been pretty light on story, admittedly, and I think I'm finally starting to do them justice. I think my bias for making Jackson the sweet Papa Bear of the story with no flaws is just super obvious. Like, he is flawed, I just don't have many good flaws for him to make him a little more balanced, so I'm sorry about that. I will say this now. I can already see several of my archetypes in these characters, like this really mysterious loner type that's super hot, witty, and loyal to the people she cares about, Memori. I'll stop now. I'll leave it there. This should really be obvious by now, but I really need to tone down the angst. This is obvious to me, it's probably obvious to you, and we both need to shut up, because I just can't help it. When you're a teenager that's listened to as many zombie covers as I have, everything just goes back to unironic angst in the end, and I'm just so sorry, but, like, I'm gonna shut up because I'm gonna keep doing it, and even if I say sorry, it's not gonna change the fact that I'm gonna keep doing it, so that's my bad. Also, every time I go back to a character, I just put a little bit more of my soul into them. My paper babies are basically like my Horcruxes at this point. So if a lot of my characters start ending up sounding the same, that's my bad, literally. I will say that I've never related to Lucas as much as I do now, though, for better or for worse. And last thing I'll say is that it was fun to convert these characters from their zombie apocalypse versions back to what they originally were. Like, that's a whole nother story. It's a lot of things for another day, but I will say that Caroline going from an uninteresting sweetheart in the original version to a zombie-hunting, pro-choice prostitute, badass character in her zombie apocalypse version, to the equivalent of an exploited child actor in this new version of the original story was just interesting realizing how many versions of this character there are. The rise of the hero profession began with the life and tragedy of the Astral family, or the Refraction Force. Born in the stars and raised on Earth by an otherworldly family friend, the demigods fought villains as early as age 4 for the people of San Francisco, learning about themselves and about the world as they went. Led by their brother Lucas, they were recognized as masterful protectors early on. They fought together for 6 years, but the time came for them to take their individual paths in life, giving them each a chance to become heroes of their own merit. One became a hero to his family's legacy, preserving their household and becoming a more reflective young man. Another became an undercover spy at the villain organization Phoenix, with her brother beside her growing in prowess and popularity. Yet another studied abroad for years in Asia, while a third brother traveled to a newly built Chicago to fight Madison Astral, a corrupt businessman with the goal of taking over the entire world. The youngest and most naive sister attempted to rehabilitate villains in the safety of the redwood forests of Northern California. In time, they decided to reunite in a new city to face villains unlike those they had ever fought before: ghosts, human experiments, aliens with powers that rivaled their own. Along the way, their crystals on their right hands were cracked. Whether by destiny or coincidence, they each gained new abilities in a very small window of time, but each fracture came with a mental price. They continued to succeed as heroes despite this, even picking up a sidekick of sorts named Cassidy Joyce. However, underlying tensions broke them, leading to their demise at the hands of a monstrous spirit. He hunted down the siblings one by one, snuffed out their heroic spirits, and with the power of their crystals in his grasp, he traveled back a mere decade in time, and made a profitable future for himself. The Astral funeral was held by their employer, a hero agency, as a tribute to their achievements and an apology for not stepping in to save them from themselves. From then on, heroes were to be registered under one of many hero agencies, companies that organized heroes for the sake of the people they protected. Age restrictions were mandated to protect the mental well-being of young supers and to prevent the fate of the Refraction Force from repeating itself. While the Refraction Force's end was far too early, their legacy lived on in the changes they brought to the hero system, and in the lives they impacted. Just starting out this retrospective, I can already see patterns in my characters. There's always the character I wish I could be, that character that's more like who I am, and the part of me I wish wasn't a part of me. It's interesting, but I just want to say this. This unwritten series, especially the alternate version I wrote, is very near and dear to my heart, despite its flaws. This is one of the few stories that I really want to produce one day. I want to be a director. I think I've mentioned that maybe once or twice. It's really why I wrote 800 pages of terrible scripts last year. It's why I've drawn hundreds of characters and thousands of variations of them. It's why I'm making these videos in the first place. Maybe I'll make it, maybe I won't, but if I ever get a chance to make one thing and have it seen by people, this is on the top of my list for things that I want to revise again and make into a reality, because it's really everything I stand for in my stories. Family, the occasional conflict that comes with relatives and siblings, the dabble of romance, the dabble of space and stuff, friendship, the complexities of success, finding yourself, and I think most of all, child murder. Yep, a lot of that. Thanks for watching, guys. This is V for Verbatim, signing off until the next video. Take care. And then a quick break. Lemon lime. Another jelly break. Ooh, Dr. Pepper.